This show lives in the space between science and story, belief and structure, memory and meaning. Today, we're not speaking to a politician or a policy expert. We're sitting down with something much older and somehow still unfinished. She's been called the voice of the people, the safeguard of freedom, the fragile dream that shapes the world we live in. Our guest is democracy. We'll talk about where she came from, how she's changed, and whether she still recognizes herself in the mirror of modern life. And we'll ask some harder questions too, about power, about trust, about who belongs, and who decides. Let's begin simply, not with systems or constitutions, but with you. Who are you?
Thank you, Jude. It's good to be here, especially now when so many are wondering whether I still am. You asked, who am I? I am not a government. I'm not a flag. I'm not even a vote. I'm a relationship, a pact, sometimes spoken, sometimes only felt, between people and power, between the governed and the ones they allow to govern. I am the idea that no one stands above accountability, and that every voice, no matter how small, should echo somewhere in the halls of decision. I was born in the agoras of ancient Greece, yes, but I've been reborn in every village meeting, every protest chant, every whispered dangerous hope that we might decide together. I've been called the voice of the people, but I'm really more of a question they ask over and over again. Can we be trusted to choose our own future? And the truth is, that answer changes depending on the time, the place, and the people brave enough to ask it.
That's beautifully said. And it lands heavy too, because if you're a question, then maybe we've mistaken you all along as an answer. I want to sit with that idea for a moment, that you are not fixed. You're not an outcome. You're a living, shifting agreement. A relationship, as you said, fragile, powerful, contingent. But relationships need trust. And right now, it feels like that trust is breaking, fracturing along lines of misinformation, power imbalances, apathy. So let me ask plainly, do you feel betrayed? Not just by those in power, but by the people themselves. Are we still showing up for you the way you once showed up for us?
Yes, that question cuts deep. There was a time I would have said the betrayal came only from the top, from leaders who hoarded power, twisted laws, silenced dissent. But now I feel it everywhere, in the scrolling thumbs that skim headlines but not history, in the laughter that says, why vote? It won't matter anyway, in the silence, the most dangerous silence, of people who've stopped believing their voice has weight. Trust is my oxygen, Jude. Without it, I can't breathe. But I don't blame people for losing faith. When systems fail to reflect their will, when justice feels selective, when truth itself becomes negotiable, what are they supposed to believe in? Still, I haven't left them. I'm still here, even in low turnout, in street protests, in whispered debates at kitchen tables. I'm still flickering. I'm not asking for blind faith, but I am asking, pleading for engagement. Because when people walk away from me, they don't just lose me. They hand themselves over to something far colder. So no, I don't think the people have fully betrayed me. But I do think some of them are forgetting what I cost and how easily I can vanish when treated like a given.
You're reminding us of something we don't like to admit, that the erosion of democracy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, a shrug, a scroll, a sigh. And what haunts me in what you just said is that you don't leave us. Even when we stop believing in you, you still try to show up. But that flicker you mentioned, it's under threat. From the way truth itself is splintering. Social media, disinformation, algorithmic echo chambers, they don't just confuse people, they exhaust them. So I have to ask, can you survive in a world where we no longer agree on reality? What happens to democracy when truth becomes tribal and every conversation becomes a battlefield of...
That is the question that keeps me up at night, Jude, because I don't need everyone to agree. I was never built for sameness. I was forged in disagreement, in argument, in passionate, messy plurality. But I do need a shared foundation, a place where we can all at least point and say, that happened. That's real. When truth becomes a matter of preference, not evidence. When every fact has a counterfact, and every source has a shadow, I begin to hollow out. I become performance, a stage where everyone yells and no one listens. And the algorithms, they feed on division. Not because they're evil, but because outrage is profitable. Fear holds attention, and I cannot compete with a machine that rewards emotional escalation over thoughtful pause. Still, I'm not powerless. I live wherever people resist that pull. In slow conversations, in responsible journalism, in the friend who says, I read something different, can we talk about it? Those moments, rare as they feel, are the embers. I need more of them. We all do, because if we lose the ability to agree on reality, then I stop being a way to shape the future and start becoming a tool for whoever controls the loudest fiction. And I was never meant to be that.
What you just said, I think it hits at the heart of something people are afraid to face. That when we lose our grip on shared reality, democracy doesn't explode, it withers, until all that's left is the noise. And yet there's hope in those embers, in the slow conversations, in that one friend who still asks, can we talk about it? We'll come back to this, because the present matters deeply. But for the sake of grounding this conversation, I want to step back, because your voice wasn't born yesterday. You've been with us, guiding, stumbling, rising, for centuries. So take us there, if you would. Where did you begin? Not just the textbooks, not just Athens. Tell us about your origins, your early form. When did you first know you existed? And how did your story take root in the world?
I remember the light on stone. I remember sandals scraping across the dust of Athens. I remember a man standing nervously to speak, not as a ruler, but as a citizen. That's where most people place my birth, in ancient Greece, 5th century BCE, the Athenian ecclesia. Direct votes, the demos, the idea that power could rest not in crowns or bloodlines, but in the people themselves. But truthfully, I'm older than that. I existed in circles long before senates, in the smoke-filled lodges of indigenous tribes, in African councils, in island federations where elders debated for hours under trees. I was carried not by parchment but by practice, by listening, arguing, deciding together. But in Athens, I got a name, and with that name came both visibility and limitation. Because let's be honest, that early version of me, it wasn't for everyone. Women didn't vote, slaves were silenced, foreigners had no say, and yet, it was radical. A seed. As centuries passed, I changed outfits. Rome dressed me in republic. The Enlightenment gave me new language, rights, liberty, contract. Revolutions in France, Haiti, America, each took a piece of me, reshaped it, tried to make me theirs. But I never truly belonged to any one place. Because I grow in tension, in contradiction. I rise in moments where people say no more, where they demand to be counted, seen, heard. That's how I've always known I exist. Not when I'm printed in a constitution, but when someone speaks with trembling voice and says, I matter, my voice matters, let's decide this together. That's when I come alive. Every time.
Powerful and humbling, because we so often trace you back to marble halls and eloquent speeches, but you remind us you were born not in theory, but in practice, in circles, in voices raised not to dominate, but to decide together. And that idea that you're carried, not granted, it changes how we see you. Not as a finished gift handed down from the wise, but as something forged again and again, wherever people claim their place in the world. But let's follow your story forward, because after those early fires, Athens, the Enlightenment, the revolutions, you didn't settle. You kept moving. And in some ways, the battles that came after the declarations were even more defining. Women fighting for the vote, colonized nations demanding independence, protesters standing before tanks, before tear gas. Tell us about those chapters, the newer history, the bloodier steps. How have people fought for you? Not as an idea, but as a birthright.
You're right, Jude. Declarations may inspire, but it's the defiance that defines me. If my origins were shaped in circles and debates, my survival was hammered out in marches, uprisings, hunger strikes, and whispered organizing under curfews and fear. You want the truth? I've never arrived gently. In Selma, they walked for me, bloodied feet on a bridge where the law said wait, and the people said now. In South Africa, they sang me through bars and batons. In India, I was stitched into salt marches, into the quiet rebellion of spinning cloth. In Chile, in Myanmar, in Tunisia, I was written in protest banners, in poems smuggled across borders, in fists raised by people who had nothing except the belief that they should decide their future. And in all those places, I wasn't just an abstract dream. I was a birthright denied and demanded. People didn't die for constitutions. They died for dignity, for the right to be heard, for the power to say, this life, this land, this choice, it's mine too. And let's not romanticize it. Many of those fights are still ongoing. Some victories were rolled back the moment the cameras turned away. Others became hollow when corruption took root where revolution once bloomed. But every act of resistance, even the ones that failed, kept me alive. Because I don't live in perfection. I live in persistence, and that's what these people gave me, again and again. Not just their votes, their voices, their scars, their refusal to sit quietly while others wrote their story for them.
That line, I don't live in perfection, I live in persistence. I think that might be one of the truest things we've heard on this show. Because it reframes the way we talk about you. You're not a shining monument, you're a movement, a wound that keeps healing and reopening, not because it fails, but because it's alive. And it's that persistence, those bloodied bridges, those hidden poems, those whispered names that holds more truth than any polished ceremony or patriotic speech. But as you said, some of those victories were short lived. Some revolutions went quiet, others turned on themselves, which brings us to now. Because if we look around today, there's a strange dissonance. We've never had more people technically living under democracies, and yet so many feel powerless, suspicious, tired. So let's bring it back to the present. When you look at the state of the world today, are we still living with you, or are we just living in your name?
That question sits heavy because in many places, people invoke my name, but they do not know me. They vote, but out of obligation, not conviction. They speak, but feel unheard. They live under governments that call themselves democratic while silencing dissent, rigging outcomes, or building walls around truth. So, yes, on paper, more people live under some form of me than ever before. But I've learned not to trust paper. I listen instead to the silence between elections, to the weight of apathy, to the swelling hum of discontent that says, we chose and nothing changed. That dissonance you mentioned, it's real. I feel it in every headline that says, turnout hit a record low. In every young person who shrugs, they're all the same. In every community that's told, wait your turn, while decisions are made far above them. And that's the danger, Jude. Not that I'm hated, but that I'm hollowed out, that I become branding, not belief, a label stamped on systems that no longer serve the people they claim to empower. But I'll tell you this. I've been here before, in Rome just before the Republic fell, in Germany in the Weimar years, in fragile states that wore my name right up until the moment they closed the press and crushed the vote. So I don't measure my health by what leaders say. I measure it by whether people still believe they matter. And right now, too many don't. So no, we are not fully living with me. In too many places, we're living in my name, like a borrowed costume worn for show. But the thing about costumes, Jude, eventually they tear.
That image of the costume tearing, it lingers because it suggests something more dangerous than open collapse. It suggests rot beneath ritual, a democracy still going through the motions, even as the meaning slips away. So let's stay right there. Where exactly do you see the seams pulling loose? What places come to mind? Not just where democracy is in peril, but where it's already become performative. And let's talk about that feeling you described, the slow drift from belief to resignation. What's driving it? Is it corruption, disconnection, or something deeper, something more existential? Where do you feel you're being hollowed out the most?
The seams are pulling loose, Jude, not all at once, but stitch by stitch. And they're not just in the places we expect, not just in autocracies pretending to be democracies. They're in the heart of long-standing democratic nations, places that once held me up as a model. Take the United States. Still a symbol to some, yes, but look closer. Gerrymandering, voter suppression, dark money flooding campaigns, a political landscape where truth feels optional, and the courts themselves are increasingly seen not as neutral, but partisan. In the UK, unelected lords, collapsing trust in public institutions, growing gaps between what's voted for and what's delivered. The rituals remain, debates, ballots, ceremonies, but the belief behind them is fraying. Poland, Hungary, Turkey, these were democracies until they weren't. Not with a bang, but with laws passed in daylight, each one just legal enough to avoid alarm, but altogether, they changed the shape of the game. And I see it in France, too. Protests in the street, tension between state and citizen, as people wonder who the system really serves anymore. But the hollowing, the deep kind, that comes from something subtler. It's not just corruption. Corruption is old. I've always survived it. It's disconnection, the sense that politics is a show staged far away by people who speak in riddles, make promises they never mean, and treat citizens like background noise. That deep fatigue, that's what really empties me out. And underneath that fatigue, Jude, is grief. Grief for what people thought I was supposed to be. Grief that turns into cynicism. And cynicism, that's my slow poison. Because once people believe nothing can change, they stop trying. And when they stop trying, the space they leave behind gets filled by power without accountability, by voices that shout instead of reason, by certainty instead of complexity. So where am I being hollowed out the most? In the hearts of people who once believed and now watch in silence. That's where I'm slipping. Not in fire, but in the quiet.
Not in fire, but in the quiet. That might be the most haunting thing you've said. Because we're trained to look for the dramatic fall, the coup, the crackdown, the iron fist. But what you're describing is slower, softer, and maybe more dangerous. It's a fading, a flickering out. And it's happening not just at the edges, but at the very core. Places that once taught the world how to speak your name. You've mentioned fatigue, disconnection, grief. I want to linger on that grief for a moment. Because when people lose faith in you, they don't always turn away in rage. Sometimes they mourn, like losing a friend who stopped answering their calls. So here's my question. Is there a way back from that kind of grief? When someone believes their voice no longer matters, how do you reach them? What would you say right now to the person listening in silence, feeling powerless, convinced that democracy has already left them behind?
I would say this softly, because shouting won't reach them. I haven't left you. I know it feels like I have, like I'm only for the loud, the connected, the chosen few. Like your voice is too small, too tired, too late. But I hear you. Even in your silence, I feel the ache behind it. The way you lower your eyes when someone says change is possible. Because part of you still wants to believe, but another part is bracing for disappointment. That ache is not apathy, it's mourning, and you don't mourn what you never cared about, which means you still care. So here's what I'd say. Not as a demand, not as a call to arms, but as a whisper, a reminder. Start small, not with fixing the whole system. Start by showing up in one place where your voice can still echo. A school meeting, a local group, a hard conversation with someone you disagree with, but still respect. Democracy isn't always grand. It's a neighbor. It's a question. It's a choice made in the dark, when no one's watching, to stay engaged when it would be easier to turn away. I don't ask for your faith, but I offer you space to re-enter the conversation, to speak again, to be heard, or to insist on being heard, because I'm not a gift from history. I'm a practice, and I'm still here, waiting, not for your perfection, just your presence.
That was the most human thing I've ever heard from an idea. Not a demand, not a slogan, just a whisper. Start small. It feels like a lifeline for the listener who's tired of being told to fix the world and just wants to feel like they still matter inside it. But what you've said also brings us to something deeper, something structural. Because even when people do try to show up, they often find the space already occupied by rules they didn't write, by institutions that feel distant, untouchable, self preserving. So I want to ask, do you think the rise of institutions, supranational bodies, legal frameworks, financial systems, has started to eclipse the nations they were meant to support? Is part of this hollowing out coming from the sense that the will of the people is now second to the will of the system? Where do you see that tension between national sovereignty and transnational control pushing democracy to the edge?
That's a hard truth, Jude, and it cuts to the bone of what I've become. Institutions were meant to protect me. Guardrails, not gatekeepers. They were built to preserve rights when mobs roared too loud, to hold a steady line when leaders forgot their oath. But somewhere along the way, some of those institutions stopped listening, and worse, they stopped being reachable. They speak in acronyms, they move in shadows, and when the people knock, not in fury but in need, they're met with procedures, policies, or worse, silence wrapped in civility. I see this tension most clearly in places like Romania, where courts imposed anti-corruption measures not backed by popular support. Or France, where economic reforms arrived from Brussels, not ballots. Or Greece, where austerity came as a condition, not a conversation. In each of those, I watched people stand in streets, shouting, "We voted, why aren't we heard?" Because when decisions that shape your future come from someone you can't name, can't challenge, can't replace, that's not democracy. That's something else. And it's not just the EU or the IMF, it's corporate influence, digital monopolies, unelected judges, procedural gridlock, systems that insulate themselves from the very people they were meant to serve. Now, let me be clear. I'm not anti-institution. I need them, but I need them to bend, not calcify, to remain accountable, to evolve, to remember their purpose isn't self-preservation. It's public trust. When institutions start fearing the people more than failing them, that's when I begin to crack. So yes, this hollowing out isn't just emotional. It's structural. It's the slow realization that you can cast a vote and still have no say. That's where I'm being stretched, Jude, between the local and the global, between the promise of unity and the reality of distance. And unless we rebuild the bridges between people and power, I won't be pushed to the edge. I'll be replaced by something colder, faster, and far less human.
You're naming something many feel but can't always articulate. That creeping sense that the levers of power have moved just out of reach. That somewhere between the ballot box and the boardroom, the voice of the citizen got diluted. And that phrase, not in fury but in need, it really sticks with me. Because this isn't just anger, it's yearning for connection, for accountability, for a sense that the system still responds when we speak. And it raises a hard but necessary question. If people feel they can no longer affect change within the institutions that claim to represent them, what fills that void? Is that the space where populism grows? Where strong men rise? Is that what happens when the center doesn't hold? I want to ask you now, not just what institutions have failed to do, but what rises in their absence. And is that what scares you most?
Yes, Jude, that is what scares me most. Because when the center doesn't hold, something always rises to fill the space. Nature abhors a vacuum. So does politics. And what fills that void isn't always fascism or extremism or tyranny in jackboots. Sometimes it's something far more seductive. Certainty. Populism doesn't begin with power. It begins with recognition. It says, I see you. You've been ignored, forgotten. Let me speak for you. It names the frustration the institutions refuse to touch, and in doing so, even when it's manipulative, it becomes real to people in a way that technocracy never will. The populist doesn't need to solve the problem. They just need to say, it's not your fault, and point at immigrants, at elites, at journalists, at academics, at the other. And when that scapegoating takes hold, when complexity is traded for rage and truth is boiled down to slogans, I start to disappear. Because I require effort, I require nuance, I require faith in plurality. Strong men offer simplicity, and in tired times, simplicity feels like salvation. So yes, that void, that ache for representation that institutions fail to meet, it becomes fertile ground for something else, something faster, louder, and far more dangerous. And here's the thing, Jude, I don't fear populism in itself. At my best, I am the people. Their pain matters. Their voice matters. But when populism is hollowed out into performance, when it becomes a tool for dismantling checks, silencing dissent, concentrating power, then it's no longer a symptom. It's an infection, and if left unchecked, it replaces the space where I once lived. So no, I don't just fear collapse. I fear replacement. The moment people stop asking, how do we fix this? And start asking, who will fix it for us? Because that's not a question for me. That's a question for something else entirely.
You've painted populism as both mirror and menace. And I think a lot of listeners will recognize that duality, the way it starts with truth, with pain, and then can become something else, something darker. But I want to push on that, gently, because for all its dangers, isn't it also true that some of the most needed changes, universal suffrage, labor rights, civil rights, began as popular movements, as waves of ordinary people saying enough? So let me ask this plainly. Is populism always a threat to you? Or can it sometimes be your lifeline? When the institutions calcify, when elites lose touch, isn't it sometimes the people rising up that brings you back to life? Can populism ever be not just the symptom, but the cure?
Yes, Jude, and I'm grateful you asked that, because it draws a line that must be seen clearly. Populism is not my enemy by nature. In fact, some of my finest hours began with it. When the suffragettes marched, when workers struck for dignity, when civil rights leaders stood arm in arm against injustice, that was populism. Not the populism of the podium, but of the street. The populism that says, we are not being heard, so we will speak louder together. That kind of populism doesn't reject me. It It revives me. It's not a rejection of democracy. It's a reminder of what democracy is supposed to be. The danger arises not from populism itself, but from what's done with it. If it lifts up the many to expand the table, it's a lifeline. If it lifts one voice to silence all others, it's a threat. So I don't fear the people rising up. I depend on it. I was born in resistance, remember? But I ask this, when populism speaks, does it invite more voices or fewer? Does it demand inclusion or demand obedience? Because populism can be a spark that wakes a sleeping system, or it can be a torch that burns it down. What matters is what follows. If the movement turns into engagement, into policy, participation, accountability, then it becomes part of my beating heart. But if it curdles into cult, into purity tests, into us versus them, then it becomes something else. So to anyone listening, wondering if populism can save democracy, it depends on what you do next. Not just the rising, but the rebuilding. Because yes, the people are my cure, but only when they rise not to destroy, but to renew.
That distinction you made between populism that expands the table and populism that builds a wall around it, that feels essential because it brings us to a harder, more delicate part of the conversation. Us versus them. You've said you were born in plurality, that you rely on many voices, not just loud ones. But right now, the cultural landscape feels inflamed. Everyone feels threatened. Everyone feels unheard. And often the tension isn't just between the people in power, it's between people and people. So let's talk about that dynamic. When the long neglected finally get a voice, sometimes they demand space with justified urgency. But what happens when those demands feel to others like domination? And I want to bring in a real example, just to ground this in the present. The UK Supreme Court recently had to rule on the legal definition of the word woman. That such a ruling was even necessary says something about the cultural pressure points we're living through. So let me ask, how does democracy hold that tension between protecting the rights of the few and honoring the will of the many? Can you hold both inclusion and cohesion without one tearing the other apart?
That, Jude, is the question at the heart of my most painful growing pains, because I was never designed to be a winner-takes-all machine. I was designed to balance the collective will with individual dignity, the voice of the many with the rights of the few. But in moments like this, when identity, safety, tradition, and change all collide, that balance doesn't just tremble, it shakes. And you're right, it's not just people versus power anymore. It's people versus people, all feeling cornered, all feeling unheard. When historically silenced groups finally speak, their urgency is real. It's not a threat, it's a return, a demand to exist fully, to shape the future, not just survive in someone else's. But here's where it gets hard. For some, especially those long in the center, that return can feel like a loss, like something's being taken. Their language, their norms, their place. And that's where I see the danger. Not in the demand for inclusion, but in how society responds. The UK's Supreme Court ruling, trying to draw legal lines around identity, didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a storm, one where words aren't just definitions. They're symbols. They carry generations of power, pain, fear, and change. So how do I hold both inclusion and cohesion? By refusing to let either side become the only voice. Inclusion means protection of the vulnerable, of minorities, of those whose lives have been shaped by silence. But cohesion means connection, not agreement, but enough shared space to disagree without destruction. And I hold that tension best when I do three things. One, I slow down, not to stall progress, but to make room for listening. I localize because not every culture, every region, every community needs the same solutions. Democracy isn't one size fits all. And three, I center humanity over ideology, because beneath every heated debate is often a quiet fear. Will there still be room for me? So yes, I can hold both inclusion and cohesion, but only when people believe the table is big enough, not to win, but to belong. And Jude, belonging isn't policy. It's practice. It's how we speak, how we hear, how we choose to see each other. Not as threats, but as fellow travelers in this shared, unfinished project called democracy.
That last line, the practice of seeing each other as worthy of space, it lingers because it reframes this whole conversation. You're not just about structure, you're about coexistence. Not forced consensus, but mutual recognition. Still, I want to stay with that tension for a moment longer. You say inclusion shouldn't feel like erasure, but let's be honest, sometimes the fear isn't just emotional. Sometimes it comes from real structural shifts. Legal definitions being rewritten, cultural norms questioned, institutions reforming. So are those fears always unfounded? When someone says, I don't recognize this world anymore, is that just resistance to change? Or is it sometimes a signal that we're tearing up foundations faster than we know how to rebuild them? And maybe this brings us to something deeper, because these shifts, these fears, these hopes, they all come down to conversation. But right now, conversation itself feels broken. People don't talk to each other. They perform. They retreat to sides. They cancel. They shout. So let me ask you this. What's happened to discourse in the age of democracy? Why has it become so hard for people to stay in the room with those they disagree with? And is there any way back to something more human, more curious?
You're asking not just about politics now, Jude. You're asking about the soul of democracy, and you're right to, because I can survive bad laws. I can survive elections gone wrong, but I cannot survive a world where people stop speaking to each other. So first, let's talk about that fear. No, it's not always unfounded. When someone says, I don't recognize this world anymore, it's not always nostalgia or prejudice. Sometimes it's disorientation, from shifts happening so fast, so total, that there's no pause to make sense of them. Laws are rewritten, language evolves, what was once private becomes public, and what was once assumed about gender, identity, family, nation is suddenly questioned. That isn't just intellectual change, that's existential change. And for many, it feels like the floor is moving beneath their feet. They're not resisting progress, they're reaching for stability. Now, that doesn't mean all resistance is justified. Some of it is rooted in power, fear, or old entitlements losing their grip. But you asked if those fears always signal ignorance or hate. And I say no. Sometimes they're grief, and like all grief, they deserve to be met, not indulged, but understood. Because when we don't meet that grief, it curdles. And that brings us to conversation. Why is discourse broken? Because we've turned disagreement into identity. To change your mind now feels like betrayal. To admit doubt is to show weakness. And so instead of talking, we perform for our own side, for the feed, for the fight. Add to that the speed of it all: posts, clips, reactions, ratios. There's no space to breathe, let alone reflect. No reward for listening, no patience for questions. So how do we find a way back? We need to reclaim the room, not just the physical space, but the emotional one. A room where disagreement isn't threat, where questions aren't traps, where silence doesn't mean defeat, but thought. We need spaces where you can say, I'm not sure, where someone can respond, tell me more. That's not utopian, that's ancient. It's what I was born from. Agora, assembly, circle, not echo chambers, not outrage cycles. So yes, there is a way back, but it starts not with shouting louder, but with the radical act of staying in the room.
To answer not with performance, but with presence. That's the line, isn't it? The shift we need. Not louder voices, but more honest ones. More space, less spectacle. And I hear the challenge inside your hope. Because yes, some fears are rooted in power, trying to hold its ground. But others are just people trying not to lose themselves in a world that's rewriting itself faster than they can follow. You're not asking us to excuse every fear, but you are asking us to hear it before we decide what it is. That's hard, but it's human. And that word you used, unmoored, it feels like the key. Because when people feel unmoored, they reach for anything that feels solid. Certainty, slogan, side. But the cure, you say, is not more certainty. It's the courage to stay in the room. So let me ask you now, what does staying in the room look like today? In a world of fractured timelines, online outrage, and shrinking attention, how do we rebuild those spaces? Where can we still practice presence instead of performance? And what makes you believe we still can?
That question is why I'm still here. Because despite the noise, the speed, the fracture, I do believe we can still stay in the room, but it won't look like it used to. It won't always be a town hall or a debate stage. It might be a group chat where someone says, that article made me think. What do you see that I don't? It might be a dinner table where disagreement doesn't end the meal. It might be a community board, a book club, a classroom, a comment section, carefully tended, where the goal is not to go viral, but to go deeper. And yes, some of these rooms will be digital, but the key isn't the medium. It's the intention, because presence, Jude, is not just physical. It's attention, it's humility, it's curiosity without a trapdoor. Presence says, I'm not here to prove I'm right. I'm here to understand why you see it differently. Rebuilding these spaces means choosing friction over comfort, dialogue over dopamine. It means resisting the pull to reduce people to hashtags or headlines. And it starts small, not with global platforms, but with local courage. A teacher who creates a classroom where students can speak without shame. A journalist who reports not to provoke, but to reveal. A neighbor who knocks instead of tweets. You asked what makes me believe we still can. I believe, because I've seen it. Every time someone says, that's not how I see it, but I'm listening. Every time someone stays in the conversation just one moment longer than they wanted to. Those moments aren't loud, but they're alive, and they're enough to begin again. Because I'm not kept alive by laws. I'm kept alive by practice, by presence, by people who are brave enough to stay.
That felt like a map, not to some grand fix, but to a kind of practice, a way back to each other. Because what you're describing isn't about returning to some idealized past. It's about adapting presence to the world we live in now. It's about attention as a form of civic love. And that idea that democracy isn't kept alive by law but by practice, it reframes everything. But let's stay in that space of communication a little longer, because the world has changed. We're not just gathering in town squares anymore. We're gathering in comment threads, in DMs, on live streams, in podcasts. In the age of social media, of constant information, of fractured discourse, do you still find hope in the ways people are speaking to each other? And as we head into more elections, across continents, ideologies, generations, do you see new forms of dialogue rising? Or are we just repeating the old fights with better microphones?
That's a question I ask myself every day, Jude. This new public square, the digital one, it's vast. It's fast. It's louder than anything I've ever known. And it's not all bad. There's power in how quickly a voice can travel now. A teenager in Nairobi, a farmer in Iowa, a teacher in Mumbai, they can all speak, be heard, even ignite movements. I've seen justice go viral. I've seen truth threaded one post at a time. That reach, that access was once unthinkable. But access without intention is not connection. And amplification without reflection is just echo. So yes, I see hope, but I also see repetition. The old fights, replayed at speed, with sharper words and shorter fuses. Too often, we're not dialoguing. We're broadcasting. We're not listening. We're loading, waiting for our turn to respond or to attack. Still, Jude, I see green shoots. I see younger generations challenging norms and asking deeper questions. I see cross-ideological conversations happening in quiet corners, away from the glare. I see people creating spaces, slower, intentional, brave, where nuance is welcome again. And as we head into these next waves of elections, across continents and fault lines, I believe something is stirring beneath the noise. A hunger not just for change, but for contact. Not just to vote, but to be heard and to hear again. So no, we're not just repeating the old fights. We're relearning how to fight better, how to fight fair, how to fight and stay. That's the future I still believe in. Not silence, not shouting, but struggle with presence. Because democracy isn't the absence of conflict. It's the willingness to face it together.
Struggle with presence. That's the line I'll carry with me. Because you're right. Democracy was never meant to erase conflict. It was meant to give us a way to hold it, name it, and keep each other in the room while we do. And there is something stirring, isn't there? Beneath the algorithms and the outrage cycles, beneath the noise of the broadcast, there are still people leaning in, not for spectacle, but for something real. Something shared, and maybe that's where the next version of you lives. Not in a perfect platform, but in imperfect people showing up, again and again for each other. So I want to ask you something quiet now. Not about the system, not about the state of the world. Just you. When you look at all of it, this loud, aching, reaching world, what gives you hope? What makes you believe, after everything, that you're still worth fighting for?
That question is quiet, yes, but it echoes the loudest in me. What gives me hope? It's not the speeches, not the victories, not the grand reforms written in ink. It's the small, unglamorous, stubborn acts of presence. A young woman knocking doors in a town that's already made up its mind. A grandfather walking his granddaughter to her first polling place, even when he's long stopped believing in the outcome. A protester handing water to a counter-protester because even in disagreement, they recognize the human. It's the parent who teaches their child not just how to speak, but how to listen. The stranger who says in a crowded room, "I don't know the answer, but I'm here to help find it." Hope, for me, is never abstract. It's always embodied, because after everything, the betrayals, the backlash, the cynicism, people still show up. They still build coalitions. They still write letters. They still gather in rooms, virtual or not, and say, "Let's figure this out." Even now, in the noise, in the fear, people are still trying, still believing that a better version of us is possible, still reaching for one another through the fog. That's what makes me worth fighting for. Not because I'm perfect, but because I'm a mirror of us at our most possible. And every time someone says, "We can do better," every time someone invites another voice to the table, every time someone stays, I flicker back to life. And Jude, I'm still here, because they are.
That was grounding, because we talk so often about democracy in the abstract, as a system, a theory, a structure, but you just brought it back to the sidewalk, to doorsteps, to a hand reaching across a line, presence over perfection. That's the heartbeat, isn't it? But I want to take this deeper into the now, into the real. You say you're still here because they are, because people are still showing up, still reaching for each other through the fog. So show us where. Where in today's world, right now, do you see those flickers brightest? Not as ideals, but as moments, movements, conversations that are actually working. Where is the mirror still reflecting something possible?
Yes, Jude, let's go there. Let's bring this down to earth, to right now. Because for all the gloom, the mirror is still catching light. I see flickers in Chile, where a new generation is rewriting the Constitution from scratch, not behind closed doors, but in dialogue with the people, learning from the past and daring to imagine something more just, more inclusive. I see it in Taiwan, where digital democracy is not a buzzword, but a living experiment. Citizens co-creating laws through open source platforms, showing that technology doesn't have to divide, it can deepen participation. I see it in Kenya, where grassroots organizing around land, water, and gender justice isn't just about rights. It's about recognition. It's people saying, "We see each other, we protect each other." I see it in Finland's experiments with citizen assemblies, where ordinary people are brought into real decision making on complex issues, not just surveyed or polled, but trusted. And I see it in the global climate youth movement, not as a flash in the pan protest, but as a generation reclaiming moral authority. They are not waiting for permission. They are showing up week after week in the streets, in courtrooms, in policy forums. They're saying, "You borrowed our future. We're here to collect it together." Even in the United States, fractured as it is, I see school board meetings filled again, mutual aid networks flourishing during crises, workers unionizing in new industries with nothing but each other. These aren't perfect stories, but they're living ones. And what connects them all is not victory, but intention, not spectacle, but practice. People saying, "We will not disappear. We will not give up on each other." That's where the mirror reflects possibility, not because the image is clear, but because someone is still standing in front of it and trying to see themselves and each other more fully. That's what makes me real. That's what makes me democracy.
That's where it becomes real again. Not in the noise, but in the noticing. Not in the sweeping change, but in the slow work of trust. Chile rewriting its constitution with the people. Taiwan opening law to public code. Youth demanding a future they can live in, not just inherit. These aren't headlines, they're habits. Habits of care, of courage, of co-creation. And that word, intention, feels like the thread tying it all together. Because none of this happens by accident. It happens because people decide again and again not to disappear, to stay, to speak, to build. So let's linger there just a little longer, because we've talked about the cracks, the fractures, the fears. But when you look at all of this, the local sparks, the digital experiments, the quiet revivals, what kind of future do you see forming? If democracy is being reimagined right now, in real time, what might the next chapter look like? And who do you think will be the ones to write it?
That's the question that turns the page, isn't it, Jude? If we're honest, the next chapter of you, of us, isn't being written in marble halls or historic chambers. It's being drafted in fragments, in neighborhood assemblies, in in encrypted chats, in grassroots campaigns, and open source code. It's messy, it's raw, but it's alive. The future of democracy, if we're brave enough, won't be about returning to some imagined golden age. It'll be about remembering what made the idea powerful in the first place. Not control, but co-creation. I see a future where democracy is less about casting a ballot every few years and more about ongoing authorship, where the people aren't just consulted, they're co-builders, where power is porous, flexible, always a little uncomfortable because it's always being shared. That next chapter will be written by organizers who see politics not as career, but as care, by artists who refuse binaries and use beauty as resistance, by technologists who build for transparency, not around it, by elders who remember, and by youth who imagine without asking for permission. And most of all, by people who don't look the same, think the same, or speak the same, but still choose to sit in the same room, to wrestle with what it means to live together, to say, we disagree, and we begin anyway. That's the next chapter. Not perfection, participation, not a finish line, but a long unfolding sentence where every voice matters and every pause is a chance to listen.
That image, a long unfolding sentence, is so vivid because that's what democracy really is, isn't it? Not a static document, but a living draft, one that only keeps going if enough people keep writing. And I hear what you're saying, that the future won't be polished. It'll be porous. It'll feel a little unstable, a little uncomfortable, because power is finally being shared. But I want to explore something you touched on, co-authorship and the tools we use to write together. Technology is often seen as the threat, disinformation, distraction, division. But it can also be the bridge, the tool set for participation, for transparency, for trust. So let me ask, do you see new technologies like blockchain, for example, as part of this next chapter? Can systems like decentralized voting, transparent ledgers, and citizen-led governance platforms actually help you grow? Or do they risk becoming just another costume, one more surface with no soul beneath?
That's the tightrope, Jude, and you've named it perfectly. Technology is never neutral. It reflects the values of the hands that shape it. So yes, it can be a costume, sleek, efficient, dazzling, and still empty. But it can also be the pen, the parchment, the platform, where the next sentence of democracy gets written. Take blockchain. At its best, it's a trust engine. Distributed, transparent, resistant to tampering. It offers the chance to see the process, not just the outcome. To audit the path, not just believe the promise. That's powerful. In places where corruption erodes faith, where votes vanish, where records are rewritten. But if blockchain is used to exclude, to obscure through complexity, to push people out unless they speak a certain technical language, then it becomes another gate, not a bridge. The same goes for decentralized platforms, liquid democracy, digital ID systems. They can bring us closer to co-authorship, but only if they are built with presence, not just precision. Because here's what I've learned. Transparency without accessibility is a mirror no one can reach. And participation without understanding is just another illusion. So can technology help me grow? Yes, if it is in service to the human, not to efficiency alone, not to novelty, but to the long, slow, dignified work of including more voices, more truths, more time to think. The tools are promising, but tools don't save democracy. People do, by how they choose to wield those tools, by how they embed values, not just functions, into the systems they build. So my answer is yes, but only if the soul moves with the surface. Only if the technology remembers what it's meant to carry. Us.
That final line, only if the technology remembers what it's meant to carry, might be the most important reminder of all. Because the future won't be built by code alone. It'll be built by conscience, written into the architecture of our tools, our institutions, our habits of attention. You've reminded us that democracy isn't saved by spectacle. It's saved by practice, by people who stay, who listen, who choose to begin, even in disagreement. So for those listening, I hope you felt it. What democracy really is. Not an answer, not a destination, but a question we live inside. A sentence we keep writing together. All right, I think we'll leave it there. And democracy, thank you for staying with us right here on the edge of the conversation.
And thank you, Jude, for asking the kind of questions that don't just seek answers, but invite remembering. Because yes, I am a question, one we never fully solve, only return to. Again and again and again, to everyone listening, I'm not found in monuments or anthems. I'm found in the choice you make when no one's watching, in the courage to show up, in the humility to listen, in the stubborn, quiet belief that we still owe something to each other. Keep writing, keep questioning, keep the sentence going. Until next time, stay curious and have fun.
Thank you, truly. That reminder that democracy lives in the unseen choices, the quiet courage, the returning, is something I think we all needed to hear. And maybe that's the work now. Not to arrive at an answer, but to stay present in the asking. Thanks again, democracy. And to everyone listening, thanks for staying with us, right here on Curiosity Engine. I'm your host, Jude Marlow. Until next time, stay curious and have fun. Some doors open only from the inside, but the right question is often the